So the story that I have to relate is from the Dhammapada commentaries, and it's the story of how Magha, Prince Magha, managed to become Sakka, the king of the gods. So Sakka he actually appears in the suttas quite a bit. He's the king of the Devas of the 33, which is the Devas that live in what's called the Tawatingsa heaven, which is at the top of Mount Sindaru. And if you're not familiar at all with the Buddhist cosmology, Mount Sindaru is the center of the world system. It's a gigantic mountain, much, much larger than the volume of planet Earth. And it's in the middle of this cosmology that involves basically concentric rings of mountains and oceans with continents of human realm sort of floating in the outside of that. So it's the center, and we're the human realm sort of on the periphery. Tawatingsa heaven, Tawatingsa just means 33. It's the heaven of the 33. And Sakka is the principal ruler of this world realm, at least the realm of the gods. So the story begins with Matali, the Lichavi, I think. He's a disciple of the Buddha, and he's heard the Buddha tell a story about Sakka, and he's wondering whether Buddha's really seen Sakka or not. He's kind of doubtful. He says, it's not easy to see Sakka. So he goes to the Buddha, and after paying respects, he says, have you actually seen Sakka, or could it just be like someone who really looks like Sakka? The Buddha replies, no, I've actually seen him. I know how it is that he became Sakka. And so, of course, Matali asks, well, how did he do that? And he says he lived the life of a householder, observing 7 vows. And the 7 vows were they're kind of Brahmanical vows, but they're vows of virtue. The first vow is, for as long as I live, may I support my mother and father. And then down the list, for as long as I live, may I respect the elders of my household. For as long as I live, may I be truthful. May I not give in to avarice or divisive talk. May I be friendly and gentle in speech. And for as long as I live, may I be generous. So this generosity turns out to be like the key for Magha's rebirth in heaven. And so the Buddha relates these 7 vows and says, Magha, they're really excellent job of upholding these vows. He's very diligent and heedful. And through this heedfulness, at the end of his life, he was reborn as the king of the gods. In the commentary, Matali wants more detail. He says, well, how exactly did he go about doing it? And so then we get this commentarial story. And so the Buddha says, well, I'll tell you. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in the country of Magadha, there was a prince named Magha. And so because he was a prince, his name would be Maghava. So Maghava was this prince in a village in this country. And he got it into his head. He decided that he had taken on these vows, and he was focusing a little bit on meritorious deeds, but he hadn't really decided what to do. And so he had some business or other in the village, the central part of the village, and so he goes to the central part of the village on this business, and while he's waiting to do whatever it is that he's going to do, in a medieval village like that, or a pre-medieval village, there's no trash pickup, and the roads aren't really being looked after. Public areas will tend to be like rutted, muddy. There'll be effluvia of various sorts like distributed around. And so while he's waiting, he uses his feet to clear a spot, make it nice and level and smooth and flat and free of any kind of debris. A comfortable place to stand. And then he stands on it. And while he's standing there, another man comes up to him and just kind of like sees the spot and wants it and kind of elbows him out of the way and stands in his spot. And because he's taken this vow against anger, he doesn't get mad. He gets interested. He makes himself another spot and stands in it. Another man comes along and pushes him out of that spot and stands in his spot. And he doesn't get mad at that man either. He just makes another spot. And pretty soon he's like making spots and people are filling the spots. And he thinks to himself, this thing of making a flat spot is very pleasing for men. They seem to really like it. I'm going to do more of this. Right? So he kind of takes what could be a bad situation and makes it into a good situation. And the next day he comes back and he clears like an entire threshing floor's worth of flat spots, and like all the town's business ends up happening on that big flat area that he creates. And during the cold season, so he's like maintains this nice flat clean area, and he starts building a fire during the cold season. It becomes like everybody's favorite place to go, the town hangout spot, Maghava's flat spot. And he thinks, oh, this must be meritorious. I'm going to do more meritorious things like this, because it conduces to the welfare of people. And he gets it into his head to do something about the road. And the road connecting villages in a time like that, of course, is just like an animal track that's been used by human beings, and they start dragging carts along it. And so it's rutted and muddy, and it's got trees growing in it. And so he decides to make it smooth and flat and easy to travel on. And so during his spare time, he just goes out there and he starts working on the road, flattening it out, making it smooth. And one day someone sees him doing this and says, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, "I'm following the pathway to heaven." And this other man says, "Oh, I want to follow the pathway to heaven too. Can I come be your companion? Can I come along?" He says, "Sure." And then the next day another man comes and the same thing happens. And so then he's got two guys helping him out. And this continues on until he has 33 young men working with him, clearing the road that leads to this village. And so 33 young men working every day in their spare time on a road is 33 young men who are not hanging out in the bar. And the village headman owns the bar. So the village headman's like, he's not that happy about like this public works project. And so he says, you guys really, you're kind of working too hard. Why don't you go hunting, go fishing, and then come back and have a party? Come and get drunk. And they say, no, we don't want to do that. We're following the pathway to heaven. And the village headman doesn't like being told no. And so he goes back again and again, keeps telling them that they really had to give up this road building project and come and lay down those tools and do some hunting and fishing and come back and party. And the more he insists, the more firmly they resist his temptations. So eventually he becomes very angry and he goes to the king and he says, "Great king, there's this band of marauders who are roaming about the forest committing depredations." And the king says, "Arrest them." And so the village headman arrests Maghava and his 33 companions and hauls them before the king. And the king looks at them and says, "Your punishment is death by trampling." And so he says, "Have them trampled by an elephant." So the king's not very diligent in his inquiries as a justice of the peace. One could find fault with his performance in this regard because he makes no inquiry other than believing the headman and condemning these young men. So they haul them out to the execution ground and lay them on the ground, and they fire up an elephant to come and trample them. And Maghava tells his companions, "Look, the only thing we've got going for us is the power of our goodness, right? So as we're about to be trampled to death, fill your hearts with love and compassion towards the king, love and compassion towards the village headman, love and compassion to the elephant who's about to trample us. Let that be the last thought in your mind," right? And so they're following Maghava, so they all do it. And as the elephant comes running up to trample them, it decides not to. It stops. And the elephant trainer can't get the elephant to trample them. So they decide that this is because the elephant doesn't like to trample a whole lot of people. And so they have a big grass mat thrown over the men, and they get the elephant back out. So the elephant can't see what he's trampling. So they get the elephant going towards the grass mats, and the elephant from pretty far away decides, "No, I'm not doing it," and just won't trample the men. So the king hears about this, and he says, "There's something wrong here." He goes out, and as the men brought back before him, he says, what is it? What's going on? Is there anything that I, as your king, haven't provided for you? And they go, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, you're going around the forest committing these depredations. Who told you that?" "Well, the village headman. He told me that." "Well, that's not true. We weren't committing depredations. We were smoothing out the road." And he says, "Oh, oh, I'm so embarrassed. An elephant was able to discern your goodness, but I was not. I'm a human being. Please pardon me." So they forgive the king, and the king then takes the village headman and his entire family and gives them the Magha as slaves. And then he says, and I'm going to give you this entire village to do with as you wish, and I'm going to give you a riding elephant. And a riding elephant's like being given like a private jet or something, like back at this time. So the 33 men who have been following Magha, they're taking turns riding the elephant around the village, and they're thinking, wow, these meritorious works. I mean, even in this very life, these meritorious works really have like paid off. Let's do even more meritorious works. And so they get the idea to build a big hall for travelers to rest in. And they're thinking like anybody who comes to the village needs a place to rest and recover. And this would be like another public works for them to do. So they commission this hall. And in Magha's house, there are 4 women. Basically, he has 4 wives. And they kind of see what's going on with this meritorious action thing. And they want a piece of the action. But Magha doesn't really invite them, and it's not traditional for women to get involved in building projects. But he has a clever wife whose name is translated as Goodness. And Goodness, she goes to the builder of the hall. So Magha commissions this great big hall to be built. Goodness goes to him, and she gives him a bribe and says, I want some sort of like representation in the building of this hall. Can you help me out? And the builder says, yeah, I got you covered. And what he does is he goes off and he fells a huge tree and then flattens it out and wraps it up in a cloth to season, sets it aside for a year while the hall's being built. And this is going to be the pinnacle beam. And he carves Goodness's name on it. This pinnacle beam is for Goodness, or something like this. And so he stores it away and doesn't tell Magha about this little scheme. So at the end of the building year, when the building's about to be erected, and they prepared the foundations and everything, the builder goes to Magha and says, we've got one little problem here, a little fly in the ointment. We haven't got a pinnacle beam. We forgot. And Magha says, well, what can we do? He says, well, we can't fell a fresh tree. It's got to be seasoned. What you should do is go around the village and see if anybody's got one of these things for sale, who's had a building project that they canceled or whatever. And they find out that, yes, Goodness has got one in her back pocket. So Magha offers to buy it from her for 1,000 pieces of money. And she says, I'll give it to you for free if you give me a share of the building. And he says, no, I want all the merit on this one. I'm not going to share it with you. And the builder figures out that it's because Magha has got some sort of prejudice against women participating. And the builder says to him, look, there's no place in the realm other than Brahma's world where women are excluded, right? You can't keep her out. It's ridiculous. Besides, we won't get the building done without that pinnacle beam. And so Magha relents, and Goodness gets to have her beam put up in the middle of the hall. And the beam says, this is the Hall of Goodness on it. So every traveler who comes there sees that. And the names of Magha and the 33 other men who are contributing to his followers, they don't appear anywhere in the hall. So they kind of divide up the hall into a section for kings and aristocrats, a section for poor people, and a section for sick travelers. And they have 33 seats installed. And whenever a traveler comes and sits in one of those seats, each seat's sort of assigned to one of Magha's 33 followers. That person then gets invited to that follower's home for being sort of looked after. So they get like a bed, and they get a massage, and they get a meal, and so they're providing a really, really nice public service for travelers. Magha's other 3 wives also hear about this thing that Goodness did, and they think to themselves, well, the second one's name her name is Joy. And she thinks, what can I do? I mean, the building's built. I want to do something that's going to contribute to this public work. I know. Everybody who travels is like hot and dusty. I'll build a bathing pool. And so she has a pool dug, which provides both drinking water and bathing water, and everybody who comes there gets to use the pool of joy. And he has another wife whose name is Thoughtful. And she says, anybody who's come and been taken care of and bathed and is about to depart, they should depart with like garlands. They should be just completely joyful with their departure. So I'm going to have a gigantic flower garden built. And so she has this big flower garden built, and everybody who leaves there gets like a really nice garland on the way out. So Thoughtful's garden, Joy's pool, and the hall for the travelers is one of the great works that Magha sponsored during his lifetime. His 4th wife, however, her name is translated as Wellborn. And Wellborn thinks to herself, I'm actually Magha's cousin, second cousin, like her. And I'm also his wife. And so I'm so connected with him that any merit he makes accrues to me, and any merit I make accrues to him. So I really don't need to do anything. And she spent the rest of her life just adorning herself. So Magha has 4 wives. So at the end of his life, Magha, because of his heedfulness, dies and is reborn, spontaneously reborn in this heaven realm, which turns out to be already occupied. And it's occupied with the resident gods who are called Asuras. And when Magha and his 33 guys show up there, they want to welcome them in Asura style. And so they prepare a huge batch of celestial liquor. And they invite them to come and, have a party with them. And of course, Magha and his guys, they've seen this trick before, the village headmen, right? So Magha says, like, don't you guys drink any of that stuff. So the Asuras are, hammering it back, and Magha's boys are keeping their mouths shut. And the Asuras get just completely drunk, and they all pass out. And Magha looks at these guys, and he thinks, why should I share my kingdom with these guys? And he signals his followers, and they grab the Asuras by their heels and pitch them off the top of Mount Sindaru into the ocean. And so the Asuras on the way down Mount Sindaru, which takes quite a while actually, because it's 84,000, something yojanas. On the way down, because of their merit, right? Obviously they've been born in the heaven before. Like not all their merit's gone now. So on their way down the side of Mount Sindaru, spontaneously the palace of the Asuras at the foot of Mount Sindaru appears, and that's where they land. Boom, foot of Mount Sindaru. And along with the palace of the Asuras, there's also a tree called the pied trumpet flower tree, and this tree blooms every so often, and it's one of the features. A blooming tree is one of the features of any significant celestial realm. So as soon as the Devas win this battle with the Asuras, the first of many to come, the city of the Devas spontaneously appears around them. And so this city is in typical overwrought Hindu style. It's 10,000 leagues wide and 10,000 leagues deep, and it's got banners hanging from the walls that are 300 leagues long, and it's just amazingly incredible. It's all made out of gold and jewels and pearls and lapis lazuli and coral, and there's pools and ponds and parks, and I did a little math, and it's about 30 times the size of the continental United States, and it's gigantic. It's really, really big, And this is for 33 gods altogether plus their king. It's a really big place. And interestingly, none of those other 33 gods gets a name, at least not in this episode. But the elephant gets reborn in the heaven too. And so the elephant's name, I think, is Arathane or something like this. And he is reborn as a god, so he doesn't have his elephant form. But when he wants to play, he goes into one of the parks and retakes on his elephant form. But he's 150 leagues tall. A league is like 3 miles. So he's a gigantic elephant playing in this gigantic park. And he's also like a creator god. So he creates a palace, kind of like a park-like thing for Sakka, the new god, the new king, which is a giant water jug with a canopy over it and a seat at the bottom of it. And this is like a couch, which is like 100 miles long, and Sakka sits there when he's relaxing. He also gives each one of the 33 gods, 33 follower gods, their own water pot, and this water pot has, it's like 3 miles in diameter, and it has elephant tusks coming out of it, which are really long, and out of each elephant tusk, there's a giant lotus aquarium hanging off of it, 7 of them. And every aquarium has 7 lotuses growing out of it, and every lotus has 7 flowers on it, and every flower has 7 leaves. And on each leaf, there are dancing 7 celestial nymphs. So I did a little math, and it turns out that there's about 3.9 million nymphs dancing around Sakka pretty much all the time. So that's kind of the population of the city. There is at least this many nymphs. So celestial nymphs turns out to be like a central population feature of the city of the gods. At, we'll see as we kind of go along. So anyways, two other things that happen is when they were building the hall, Magha had planted a special tree, an ebony tree, to kind of mark the auspiciousness of that good work. And correspondingly, in the city of the gods, there's born something which is called the coral tree. And the coral tree blooms every so often, and the coral tree blooms are extraordinarily beautiful and glorious, and it occupies a lot of attention in the Tao Te Ching heaven. And he also had a stone seat built at the base of the tree that he had built in the hall, and so a corresponding Yellowstone seat, which is like 15 miles thick and 60 miles wide, appears at the base of the coral tree. And so whenever Sakka sits on that, that's his throne. It like sinks halfway into the earth, and when he gets up, it comes back out again. So everything's on just this enormous celestial scale. When goodness dies, she's reborn there as one of his wives. And when she's reborn, spontaneously with her, assembly hall of the gods appears in the city of the gods. So the assembly hall of the gods is, in the story, it's like where the law is preached every 8 days, kind of like a Buddhist thing that got inserted into what's essentially a pre-Buddhist tale. But that's where the gods assemble to do their battle plans when the Asuras are going to attack. And when joy passes away, a giant lotus pond appears inside. I think it was 1,500 miles in diameter. Lotus pond appears in the city of the gods, and it's just an incredibly delightful pond. Everybody likes to go there for walks. And then when Thoughtful dies, an enormous garden appears, a creeper garden they call it, where when a deity is coming to the end of their days and the signs of their imminent passing comes up, they go to her garden to be sort of gladdened by its beauty before they pass away. So they just kind of stroll around in this amazing garden that Thoughtful's good karma created. So this is sort of like a hospice for the gods, because gods don't last forever. And then we get to Wellborn, who spent her life adorning herself instead of doing meritorious acts. And she's born as a crane in a mountain cave. So Sakka was wondering about Wellborn, so he looks around with his mental clarity and sees that she's been reborn as a crane. And he goes to her and he says, "You foolish girl, what are you doing here?" And she says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm your husband, Sakka. I'm king of the gods." And she's like, "Oh my God, what? How did you become king of the gods?" And he says, "Well, meritorious acts. This result that you have here is because of your non-meritorious acts. You got reborn as an animal. But look, would you like to have a tour of the city of the gods?" And she says, "Well, yeah, sure." And so he takes her in the palm of his hand and goes back to the city of the gods and sets her down on the bank of Joy's lotus pool. And she's like, "Wow, this is incredible." And he says, "Well, would you like to see your former companions? Goodness and Joy and Thoughtful?" And she says, "Yeah, that sounds like it would be nice." And so Sakka invites the other wives to come over and meet up with Wellborn, and they look at her and they go, "Ooh, well, look at that beak. Look at those legs. Look at those feet." Now, this is the result of a life spent adorning oneself. And they all kind of snip at her and they kind of turn their backs. So later after this meeting, Sakka comes back to her and says, "So did you see the other women?" And she's like, "Yeah, they all made fun of me. I want to go back to the mountain cave." And so Sakka takes her back and he says, "Well, when you met with the other wives, did you notice their celestial glory?" She says, "Yeah, I did." "Well, would you like to be reborn in similar circumstances?" She says, "Well, yeah, sure I would." And he says, "Well, I can give you an admonishment, and if you follow the admonishment, you'll eventually be reborn in that circumstance." And she says, "Okay." He says, "If I admonish you, will you follow the admonishment?" And she says, "Yes, I will. I'll do whatever you tell me." And so he gives her the 5 precepts. Because you have to hold these precepts like iron. You can't break anything ever. She's a crane, so there's not a whole lot of things that she can do. So she takes on the practice of only eating fish that have died from natural causes. And Sakka comes and tests her. He comes and appears as what appears to be a dead fish on the sand. And so Wellborn goes up to eat the fish, takes it into her beak, and just as she's about to swallow, the fish flips its tail a little bit. She realizes it's still alive, and she spits it out. And so Sakka does this to her like 3 times. And he appears to her again and says, okay, you're doing good, just keep it up. And sooner than you think, you'll end up in the realm of the gods. And so sure enough, she like basically starves to death as a crane. That happens pretty quickly. And then she's reborn as the daughter of a potter in Benares. And when she's 15 or 16 years old, Sakka thinks to look for her, and he sees her in Benares, and he appears as a cucumber seller. But the cucumbers are really precious jewels, simply appearing as cucumbers. So he's got a cart with cucumbers going through this Benares, and he's saying, cucumbers for sale. And people come up and says, what do you want for your cucumbers? He says, I'm only selling to the people who are keeping precepts. And they go, precepts? What are those? Black ones or brown ones? And he says, no. If you don't know what they are, don't worry. But that's what I'm looking for. And so he keeps telling people this, and eventually someone says, well, there's this girl. She's a potter's daughter. And all she does is she says, I'm keeping precepts. So Sakka goes and finds her and says, okay, he reveals himself to her. And he gives her the cucumbers, and they turn into precious jewels. And she says, with these jewels, you'll be able to sustain yourself for the rest of your life. Keep those 5 precepts. And so she does. And she dies at the end of a human life and is reborn in the Asura realm as the king of the Asura's daughter. And her name is Suja. And Suja is extraordinarily beautiful. She's like the most beautiful thing ever. And it's because she kept precepts perfectly for 2 lifetimes. And the king of the Asura realm, his name is Vepachiti. And Vepachiti, he's actually a little not jealous of his daughter, but he's really possessive of her because she's so incredibly beautiful. All the Asura princes want her for themselves. And, Vepachiti's like, no, you're not good enough for her. No. So he basically says no to everybody and eventually decides to let her choose for herself from amongst all the Asuras who she'd like for her husband. And he gives her a garland, and he says, just throw this over the head of whoever it is that you want, because they all want you, so just pick one. And so she's looking around saying, God, are any of these guys good enough, And at that moment, Sakka realizes that he needs to look in on her. He sees what's going on, and he immediately appears at the very edge of the Asura assembly as an old Asura. And as soon as she lays eyes on him, all the kind of karma of their association together, she immediately feels this incredible rush of love, and she says, "There's my husband," and throws the garland over his head. And all the other Asuras are like, "Oh my God, like this old guy." They're all so ashamed, So it's like, oh. So she's like, he's old enough to be her grandfather. Jeez. So they're all disappointed. And so Sakka takes her hand, and then he announces to the assembly, "I am Sakka," and flies up into the air, taking her with him. And they are like, "We've been fooled by old Sakka." And so they all start strapping on their swords and getting on their chariots, so they're going to chase him. Well, just outside, Matali, Sakka's charioteer, has pulled up the chariot, and Sakka helps his new bride get onto the chariot, Suja. And so he gets on the chariot with her, and Matali fires up the 1,000 horses that are pulling the chariot, and they go zooming off towards the city of the gods, and the Asuras are like right behind them. And we're going to get you, Sakka. So they're chasing Sakka up the side of Mount Senaru, and when the chariot's approaching the silk forest, there's newly born Garuda nestlings who hear them coming and start crying out in fear. Garudas are kind of birds. And Sakka hears these Garuda nestlings, and he's like, "Matali, what is that noise?" And he's like, "Oh, this is the Garuda nestlings. They're afraid that we're going to trample them because we've got 1,000 horses here that are pulling along at a couple thousand miles an hour." So he's like, "Oh, well, we can't trample those poor nestlings. Turn the chariot around." And so Matali says, "Yes, sir." He turns the chariot around. Basically, all he has to do is like signal with a whip at the horses, and the horses all know, and they turn the chariot around. And so they're coming straight at the Asuras. And the Asuras see this happening, and they're like, "Oh, that's Sakka. He must have reinforcements." And so they turn around, and they go panicking back into the Asura city. And so they end up going back by the same road, back by the same gate, and they could never sort of hold their heads up again after that. So anyways, this is how Suja ends up coming back to Sakka as his wife. And he installs her as the chief of 25 million celestial nymphs. So she's got a lot of followers in the city of the gods. But she says to Sakka, she asks for a boon. She says, I don't actually have any relatives here. I don't have any, parents. I don't have any brother, sisters. Could you grant me the boon of just taking me wherever you go? And Sakka agrees to this boon. So from that point on, the Asuras, every time the pied trumpet flower tree in their realm comes into bloom, they say to themselves, "Oh, that damn Sakka! Right now, the celestial coral tree is coming into bloom, and that's our tree." And so they get mad and they saddle up to attack Sakka. So they're going to attack Sakka. So every time around this time of year, Sakka installs guards for the Nagas, for the Garudas, for the Kumbandas, which are kind of goblins, for the Supanyas, which are, I think, a kind of a celestial bird. Ajahn would know better than I do. Anyways, these.
Supanas are the same thing as Garudas.
Okay, there you go. The Supanas, and then the realm of the four kings. They're kind of like the layers of defense for the city of the gods. And at the very gates of the city of the gods, he puts an image of Indra holding a thunderbolt. And whenever the Suras make it through those other four lines of defense, they see that image of Indra with a thunderbolt, and they lose heart and they turn away. And so this is the story of how Magha became Sakka, by being heedless in this human life, following these 7 vows, and he and his followers were reborn accordingly. And this is then it kind of comes back to the Buddha talking to Matali, the Lichavi, who came and asked him the original question. At the end of that long, long story, there's a 2-line Dhammapada verse. It's verse number 30 that the Buddha then utters, and it ends up, of course, in the Dhammapada. And the verse goes, it's about heedfulness, of course. Actually, I can't quite remember it word for word. I want to read it out, but I didn't bring the book. So, the wise are always heedful. Heedfulness is always praised in the world. Heedlessness is always despised. The heedful go to heaven. So that's the Dhammapada verse. And of course, every Dhammapada verse doesn't have a story quite that big, but that particular story also appears in the Jataka tales. And in that particular version of that same story of how a prince becomes the king of the gods, it's the Bodhisattva who's Sakka, the king of the gods, in this one. But all the kind of the other things that have to do with this battle and that battle and throwing those swords down, it's all kind of very similar. So there you go. That's how it all came about. And I think that Sakka is one of these really interesting recurring characters in the suttas. There's a whole samyutta that's got Sakka's name. It's like the Sakka Samyutta. It's got several different stories of Sakka. And there's one that I particularly like that's in there somewhere, because there was the early translation, the one that I'm kind of reciting the story from, was done in 1921, and it was republished several times, and the most recent republication was 1995. And so the English is kind of old-fashioned, and some of the assertions are a little bit like, I wish I could go look at the original Pali. But anyways, when the women want to come in Magava's household and contribute to the building, the translation says it's because Magava and his followers had given up desire for women. They decided not to allow the women any share in the building. But when Sakka is in heaven, he's surrounded by all these celestial nymphs. And celestial nymphs aren't just for dancing, So there's this story somewhere in the suttas, or somewhere in the commentaries, I think, where a woman, is reborn in a heavenly realm, in the city of the gods, and she's reborn right at the boundary between 4 of the gods' territories. So like, you can sort of imagine each one of the 33 gods has like their own continent or something, a gigantic piece of real estate in the city of the gods for their own personal purposes, and they all have a kind of a boundary that comes together. And down in the U.S., there's a place where Arizona, Utah, Colorado, they all kind of come together and they form this this is called a place called Four Corners. There's a little town there. Anyway, so at this Four Corners, this celestial nymph appears, and all 4 of the gods that are have those territories, they see her at the same time, and they all want her because she's so incredibly beautiful. And of course, celestial gods going to be this really nice, charming, beautiful being. So the celestial nymph probably doesn't really have a preference, but they all do. They all want her, and they can't decide who's going to have her as their celestial nymph. And so they bring her to Sakka. And Sakka looks at her. He wants her too. So he says to the other four gods, he says, well, tell me your thoughts when having seen the celestial nymph. Tell me the state of your mind. And so the first one goes, well, my mind has been like beating like a war drum since I laid eyes on her. And the second one says, my mind has been just like moving like the waves on the ocean. It's just completely restless since I've seen her. The third one says, my mind's been moving like a banner being beaten by a wind. It's just like that. And so they all kind of four confess to this state of mind. And Sakka says, yeah, I can see this. This has been really disturbing for your minds. Your minds are on fire. So I'll take her. So the idea that like Sakka has given up any, or that Magha gave up any sort of like desire for women is kind of put false. There's also a great, a very important, but kind of a moving sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya where the Buddha is telling a story about Sakka. He says when the Asuras and the Devas are saddling up for battle, because from time to time they get into a fight, and so the Asuras are going to attack the Devas, and the Devas are going to attack the Asuras. And sometimes the Asuras win, and sometimes the Devas win. So you never know how it's going to go, and it's a battle. So it's it requires effort, and it's things can go wrong and be painful. So when Sakka is addressing his troops, he says, whenever you feel any fear or trepidation coming up in you, just look for my standard. And when you see my standard, that fear and trepidation will pass away, because I'm bold and fearless. And if you don't see my standard, look for the standard of one of these. He's kind of labels four other lieutenant gods. Just look for their standard, and your fear and your trepidation will pass away. And then the Buddha goes on to say, even though Sakka says that, when his troops, if they feel fear and trepidation and they look at his standard, their fear and trepidation might fade away, but it might not. And why is that? Because Sakka is not devoid of lust. Sakka is not devoid of anger. He's not devoid of delusion. And so Sakka himself could be filled with fear. He could be quick to flee, and his troops can't really rely on him. But you monks, if you ever feel fear and trepidation in your effort and practice, you should recall the Buddha. You should recall the Dhamma. You should recall the Sangha. And if you recall those, then your fear and your trepidation will pass away, because the Tathagata is bold. He is fearless. He is ready to stand his place. He will not ever turn away. So this is kind of like a much more another illustration of like Sakka's fundamental worldliness, even though he's the king of the gods. So anyways, that's my story for the evening.